In the name of God. Hello, everybody. This is session 9 of your morphology lesson. As you know, in the previous sessions, I talked about chapter 3, the relationship between morphology and phonology, and I talk about some phenomena which are related to this, relationship between morphology and phonology. I introduced the allomorphs, then I talked about some process of which produce this kind of, allomorphy, the assimilation and the other phenomena. Then I talked about prosodic morphology, which is related to some, constraint, for example, phonotactic constraint. Then I talked about root and pattern morphology, and then I talked about reduplication, which exists in some languages. Then at the previous session, I talked about the primary and secondary affixes and the differences between these two kind of affixes, which here in this box you see the summary of this, differences between primary and secondary affixes. These are the differences. For example, the primary affix is often of Latin and Romance origin, but secondary affixes often of Germanic origin. The primary affixes cause a stress shift, but the secondary do not. The primary affixes usually occur closer to the stem than secondary affixes, and the primary affixes, the semantics of the derived form tend to be less compositional, but the secondary affixes tend to be compositional. The primary affixes may attach to a non-basic allomorph of the stem, but the secondary attach to the basic, stem. In primary affixes, the affix itself may have allomorphs, but the secondary, affix doesn't have allomorphs, and the primary affix may attach to non-lexical stem. These are the differences between two kinds of, affixes. In this session, the last session of about the chapter 3, the relationship between morphology and phonology, I want to talk about three phenomena: linguistic acceptation, leveling, and analogy. So some linguists talk about these three criteria. Roots and Lass have both raised the question of what to do with linguistic leftovers or linguistic junk. In both cases, it has to do with morphemes that lose their semantic content or morphosyntactic function as a result of language change and are left as contentless or functionless strings of phonemes floating around in the system. Roots and Lass's investigation on this question cover a variety of cases. They show that languages are in general intolerant of useless elements, and speakers reanalyze them as having a new role. So let's call this process linguistic acceptation. So this is the definition of linguistic acceptation. Extending a term, originally this term coined by some some other area like biology, but we can the linguists use this kind of this terminology in linguistics too. So some other linguists like the other linguists like the ones which I introduced to you considers the ingenuity that speakers show in assigning new roles to inflectional contrast whose original purpose has been lost as being related to some other principles like the contrast principle. Every two form contrast in meaning. So linguistic acceptation is therefore a natural consequence of a core psycholinguistic mechanism that makes it easier for speakers to master complex inflectional systems or to learn the meaning of new vocabulary items, and we expect to find it playing an important role in the evolution of inflectional systems cross-linguistically. One language family in which linguistic acceptation has occurred is Germanic. Germanic use this kind of, acceptation. So there, Indo-European vowel alternations within verbal paradigms came to encode the present-past distinction. For example, like English examples, write and wrote, you see here, they had originally been used to encode aspectual distinctions again. You see, this shows a kind of aspectual, in the English language. So you see here, the languages use three kind of strategies to deal with this kind of acceptation or these useless elements. One of them is they could disappear entirely. Some languages delete these useless elements. So this is one strategy. The second strategy is they could be kept as marginal garbage or meaningless idiosyncrasies of the verbs already bearing them. This is the second strategy, which some languages use this kind of strategy. And the third one, is they could be kept, but instead of being relegated to the marginal role of, the second strategy, they could be used for something new, taking on a new meaning or function. They take new role, So these are three strategies which languages use. One of them in, dealing with in relation to, useless elements. Some languages delete them. Some languages kept them as a meaningless, item, and some languages use them in a new meaning or new function, a new role. These three kind of strategies which languages use according to useless elements. So the tendency for languages to prefer regular paradigms, I want to talk about the second phenomena which I want to introduce in this session, the leveling. So the tendency for languages to prefer regular paradigms over irregular ones sometimes leads to leveling. We call it leveling. This is another strategy, the elimination of sound alternations that do not signal important differences in meaning. A classic example of leveling comes from Latin. So we use some Latin example. In prehistoric Latin, the stems of words like, for example, look at this example, colos, it means color, and honest, it means words, ended in S throughout the nominal paradigm. You see here, kolos, koloses, kolosei, and kolosem, kolosi. It's a kind of nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, and ablative you see here. So you see the example. Through regular sound change, intervocalic S became R, a process called rhoticism. So this is, we call this process rhoticism when we have S intervocalic, it becomes R. So this is rhoticism. So look at the example, Old Latin example. We have kolos, so it remains kolos. But we have kolosis, it becomes koloris, because we have a kind of rhoticism here. And kolori, kolorem, and kolore. At this point, the paradigm was characterized by two stems, one ending in S, you see here, kolos, the nominative form, and one ending in R, the oblique forms. Eventually, the final S of the nominative form was replaced by R in order to conform with the stem of the oblique form. Note also that you see here, again you see the examples. So in this kind of process we call it leveling, because you see here we have two kind of stems, one ended to S and the other to R. So this is a kind of this I mean languages I mean do not tolerate this kind of irregularities. So here we see a kind of leveling. So the first one, I mean the nominative stem, becomes the S at the end of it become R, like the other stems you see here. So we have in classical Latin nominative I mean stem color, genitive coloris, dative colori, and accusative colorum, and ablative colore. You see here, you see in these example we have just one stem, color, but in this example we have two stems, colos and color. You see, so here you see a kind of leveling. So we call this process leveling, as you see in this example. So as I told you, leveling is the tendency of languages to prefer regular paradigms over irregular ones, which sometimes leads to leveling. We call it, I mean, leveling. We have another examples from the other languages, for example Spanish and other languages, which you can read them in your book. So in discussion of leveling, we often speak of analogy. You see here, we call it a kind, I mean this process is based on some kind of analogy. A, for example, is to be as C is to do. This is a kind of analogy. The nasal infix of verbs that had it was generalized throughout the paradigm by analogy with verbs that did not have such an alternation, and that instead had a single form of the stem throughout the paradigm. Analogy is usually expressed as two equations with a missing form represented by a variable x. For example, a to b as c to x. So we should solve, I mean, we should solve for x here. This is a kind of analogy. So using modern Spanish forms for simplicity, the for example, you can look at the I mean kind of examples from Spanish and some other examples from English. We see here an example from English. Here, as in most instances of analogy, the pattern that serves as the basis of the analogy, in this case the regular plural suffix s, is more productive. You see here, stone becomes stones, so car become x. What is x? This is a kind of analogy. We solve it, cause. You see here, so sometimes the older form that existed before analogical leveling remains as a relic, I mean used for special meaning. The old plural of brother is brethren. You see, these days it is used only to refer to fellow members of a church or social organization, not to brothers in the literal sense of the term. So this is a kind of, I mean, the analogy you see in this example. So leveling and analogy are powerful forces in the development of languages over time. They are driven by a seemingly innate preference in speakers for phonological and morphological similarity between members of a paradigm or a class of words. So you see in this part, I talked about three phenomena. One, acceptation, the other leveling, and the third one, analogy. You see the definition and the examples. The last part, I think, of this chapter is morphophonology and secret languages. So we now turn to two secret languages that are permutations of existing languages. Secret languages are found around the world and have been attested in English, French, Spanish, Dutch, and some other languages. One secret language you may already be familiar with is Pig Latin. This is one of the, those sacred languages. In one variation, words that start with vowels are suffixed with way, for example. This is the example. And words that begin with a consonant or consonant cluster shift the entire onset sequence to the end and are suffixed with a. You see here, for example, ig, pay, or ifray, or some other example you see here. But inflection way, you see, this start with a kind of, vowel. So this is the, one of the sacred languages, as you see. So when speakers manipulate words in this fashion, they make use of their subconscious knowledge of linguistic entities such as onset and nucleus. Language games are therefore an instructive union of phonology and morphology. Another secret language. Another secret language is Verlan, which is based on French. The word Verlan is derived by reversing the syllables of, for example, look at this word, okay? The other way around, Verlan works best with words of 2 syllables because in these, the 2 syllables can simply be reversed. For example, look at the standard French, for example, pourri, but the Verlan word is ripou. You reverse the 2 syllables, you see here. Or branche, chebran. Petard, tarpe, you see. We reverse 2 syllables. This is a kind of another secret language. They are a kind of, odd languages. You see here, you see the example. So the monosyllables are vernalized differently depending on whether they are open or closed. In open, for example, monosyllables, the order of consonant and vowel is reversed, and closed monosyllables are treated as if they end in a schwa and therefore as if they are underlying bisyllables. So this is the definition of 2 kind of sacred languages, and the example you see here, they are a kind of odd examples and odd languages, but they existed in the world, this kind of odd languages, and they have a kind of morphology as you see here. So for Bullock, the interesting question is how the phonology of sacred languages like Verlan compares to the phonology of the language they are based on. We see that Verlan respects the basic syllable structure of French. For example, French speakers who use Verlan are aware on some level of prosodic entities such as onset, nucleus, coda, and syllable. The same can be said of English speakers who use Pig Latin. Nonetheless, Bullock and other researchers who have looked at French secret languages note that the phonology of Verlan is not the same as that of the standard language. You see, they are not the same. They have some kind of, phonological rules, but they are, they seems, odd, related, in comparison with the natural languages like French and English and some other languages, as you see in these example. So no Verlan speaker is monolingual, and there are no native speakers of Verlan. All of Verlan is based on standard French, and speakers of Verlan invariably speak French. If not natively, then under more natural conditions, according to Bullock, the rules of Verlan are artificial compared to those of the standard and natural language. So you see, there are some kind of, morphological rules, but there are some kind of, odd rules. So the like the Verlan language, as you see, no Verlan speaker is monolingual. They use both, the French language and the Verlan language, as you see in these example. So, and returning to Pig Latin, the other odd and the sacred language, in the version presented here, words that start with a consonant cluster postpose the entire cluster, then add the suffix a, for example. But another version of the sacred language postposes only the first letter. Any rule that operates on letters rather than on phonological entities such as onset is unnatural. Languages are first and foremost oral, and orthographies are systems imposed on them by people. So because of characteristics like these, sacred languages must be looked upon as somewhat artificial and should not on their own be used to draw conclusions about the workings of natural languages. So as you see, these examples are kind of, odd and these sacred languages. So you see the examples. So we can, conclude that there are some odd and sacred languages in the world, but they, have some kind of morphological rules, not maybe not a kind of natural rules, but they have some morphological rules and they use morphology in their languages. So this is chapter 3, which talked about the relationship between morphology and phonology. In this chapter, has taken the reader on a brief tour of morphophonology. So we begin by investigating allomorphs, which were introduced in chapter 1 in greater detail. We then turn to the field of prosodic morphology, selecting a few topics: minimal word constraints, root and pattern morphology, and reduplication for discussion, as I talked about them and used some examples from languages. This was followed by a descriptive, non-theoretical look at primary and secondary affixes and the differences between them. The section on linguistic acceptation, leveling, and enology deal with a completely different type of morphophonological phenomena. As you see in this session, I talked about, three phenomena: the acceptation, leveling, and analogy. It differs from other portions of this book in taking a historical perspective. For the most part, we have been concerned with synchronic phenomena. Lastly, we considered some secret languages. As you see, in one sense, they are artificial and thus should not be used on their own to draw conclusion about natural language. On the other hand, they reflect the regular applications of rules that we often find in morphological derivation and provide external evidence for prosodic notions such as syllables and onset. As you see, we talk about Latin, Pig Latin, and Verlan, two sacred languages, and we use the examples and talk about the example. And this is chapter 3. So in this chapter we introduce some phenomena which show the relationship between morphology and phonology, and as you see, there are some relationships between phonology and morphology, and we can introduce some phenomena in morphology based on phonology and vice versa. And so this chapter shows this kind of relationship. So you can read the more examples in your books, and again you can read the other material in this chapter. You can hear the voices again, and if you have any question you can ask me. I think that's enough for today, and thank you for your attention, and goodbye everybody.